Hi, everyone. Welcome to Fuqua's LinkedIn Live series. We come to you live every week on a Wednesday at 12:30 Eastern, where one of Fuqua's faculty members shares their take on the current environment and what we all might learn from that. My name is Gavan Fitzsimons. I'm the Edward S. and Rose K. Donnell Professor of Marketing and Psychology at Fuqua at Duke. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about people's reactions to some of the restrictions that we've been asked to follow over the last couple of months, and importantly, how those reactions might change in the coming months. A survey was done last week that basically evaluated how all of the states in the US were doing on social distancing and other measures. And some of the states did pretty well. Many of them did not, including last week, our own North Carolina, where obviously Duke is located, received an F on social distancing. Why might that be the case? And what are some of the manifestations of this? Well, we know churches have been holding services in defiance of state and local rules. This last week, tragically, a security guard was shot and killed because he asked a customer to wear a face mask in the store in compliance with the store's rules. We've seen armed demonstrations around the country to protest stay-at-home orders. It can be as seemingly innocuous as a group of friends getting together to play beach volleyball when the beach is closed. So in both kind of aggressive and quiet ways, millions of Americans are not following distancing guidelines in their daily lives. And so, one idea is that maybe they just don't understand what the guidelines are. I'm going to suggest that that's not really what's happening, but rather many of us are actually rejecting those guidelines consciously and going forward and engaging in behaviors that we know are not the behaviors we're being asked to follow. And so today what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about why it is that many of us bristle when we're asked to have restrictions on our freedoms and what can be done about it. And I thought before I leap into the current crisis and sort of talk about how response to restrictions on freedoms plays out currently, I'd give you just a personal anecdote to how I got interested in this topic. And so I was a graduate student at Columbia University in New York. I was, a PhD student there, and it was January, and it was the middle of a sort of a chilly, rainy streak, and I was up in my apartment, and I ran out of Diet Coke. And those of you that know me know that I drink a lot of Diet Coke, and I've always got one at hand. And I went down to the deli underneath my building to get it. And in New York, there's delis on every block. And so I walked out of the building, around the corner, into the store. Now, because I was literally like doing about a 20, 30-foot walk, I just had my soccer shorts on and a t-shirt and some flip-flops. I wasn't concerned that it was cold and rainy because I was literally going to be outside for 10 seconds. So I went into the store to the spot where the 2-liter Diet Coke was, and I went up, and I stopped in front of it, and the spot was empty. There was no 2-liter Diet Coke. And so I said to the guy behind the counter, I said, "Hey man, will you grab me some 2-liter Diet Coke from the back?" And he said, "Well, we're all out, but I'll give you 2 1-liter bottles for the same price as a 2-liter bottle." And I thought, I don't really want 2 1-liter bottles. I want a 2-liter bottle. And I sat there sort of fuming for a second. I said, forget it. And I sort of stormed out of the deli, and I decided I'd walk up to the next deli. So I walked up a block, it's one on every block. Walk up, go in, look for the 2-liter Diet Coke, no 2-liter Diet Coke. Go up to the next one, looking for a 2-liter Diet Coke, no 2-liter Diet Coke. I've got a decision to make. Am I going to walk the whole way across campus, which is like a 3-block walk, or am I giving up? So again, it's winter, it's rainy, it's cold, I'm in shorts and a t-shirt, but I decide I'm making the walk. So I walk the whole way across campus, buy myself 6 bottles of 2-liter Diet Coke, start walking back, get about halfway back to my apartment, realize I'm freezing, I'm soaking wet, and my shoulders are hurting because I'm carrying 6 bottles of 2-liter Diet Coke. And I had one of those moments. What just happened? And that was the beginning of 25 years of studying what happens when your freedoms are restricted. In that case, my freedom was a relatively innocuous freedom. There was a stock out of a product that I wanted to buy. Now, many of us have experienced these types of stockouts recently in the midst of the pandemic. And we've, for example, realized toilet paper is all of a sudden highly appealing to many of us because we can't get it. And so there are times when this reaction to a restriction can be rational, and there are times when it can be counterproductive. How does this reaction manifest? Well, there's 2 things that happen. One is that when the freedom's taken away, we really don't like the source of the restriction. So whoever's telling us we can't do something, we don't like them or it or whatever that entity is, the restriction. And then second, the thing that is restricted, Diet Coke, the ability to hug a person, to attend church and sit beside someone in a pew, that becomes way more attractive to you. So twofold sort of impact. We don't like the source of the restriction, and the thing that's restricted becomes highly appealing to us. We've been doing work on this for years, and long before the COVID-19 pandemic occurred. And this occurs in all sorts of our lives, from stockouts in grocery stores. In one experiment we did, we asked people to select a granola bar among a handful of choices. We then told them to avoid one of the brands of granola bar, which was otherwise relatively appealing. Now, normally, if somebody says, "Well, don't do that," you'd think, "Well, okay, so I should avoid that." But in fact, what we found was when you told people they can't have this one granola bar, people desperately want the granola bar. So all of a sudden, the thing that's restricted becomes dramatically more appealing. We saw choice of granola bars went up like 40% as a function of telling people they couldn't get this one granola bar. We also studied recommendations and find that when you're not soliciting a recommendation, but are just sort of going about your business. Imagine you're in a shop and you're trying on a new blazer. You've got a navy blazer and a black blazer, and you're trying them both on. And you haven't asked anyone for an opinion. What we find in our research is that when a sales associate walks by and says, "Oh, hey, Gavin, you look great in that black. You should get the black." What we find is behaviorally, all of a sudden, the blue blazer becomes really appealing to me. Just that the fact that somebody with some expertise in this area actually has provided a recommendation feels threatening to me. So, it turns out not everybody behaves the way I've just described. Some people have this tendency to backlash to recommendations or to restrictions at higher levels than others. So we find it, most pronounced, not surprisingly to those of you that are parents, amongst teenagers. Teenagers backlash to threats to their freedom very dramatically. Men tend to show it a little more strongly than women, and younger people more than older people. But across the board, like if you just did a census of America or the world, actually, about a third of people are relatively high on this tendency to backlash when someone is threatening their freedom. Okay, so now let's step into the current environment. So we're in a situation right now where sort of the key is for us to restart our economy in a way that that isn't going to trigger a massive humanitarian crisis in terms of another spike in infections. But yet, lots of folks are not following the guidelines, in part because they have this basic psychological reaction, which is to reject recommendations. I apologize. I should have said, please, if you have questions as I'm sort of presenting some of these ideas, please feel free to put them in the comments, and we'll answer them in a few minutes after I've given you sort of the gist of what I'm thinking. So one of the interesting things in what we've done over the years is that we've found that relatively simple behavioral interventions can actually have big impacts on the way people respond to restrictions on our individual freedoms. And so, so simple frames, changing the frame of the recommendation or the restriction can actually lead to much better outcomes. And I'll give you just another personal anecdote to motivate this. So if it hasn't come across, I'm a person that reacts negatively when there are restrictions on my freedoms. So if my wife calls me up and says, "Hey, honey, would you mind stopping on the way home to pick up some milk?" I'll generate every explanation known to man for why I shouldn't do exactly that. Well, it's out of my way. I'm going to be really tight on time, etc. But if she says, "Hey, honey, did you notice, are we running low on anything?" I go through and I think, "Oh, well, let's see. We'll run a little bit low on milk. I'll stop and pick it up on my way home." Flipping it so that, or reframing the question, the restriction, if you like, on my time, so that I'm the person that has agency. I'm the one that is generating the behavior that is desirable, means I don't feel nearly as threatened by that restriction of my freedom, and I'm willing to go and do the behavior. So how are we communicating currently the restrictions that are necessary as a society on our freedoms in the COVID-19 context? Well, everything is framed on as you must engage in social distancing. You must wash your hands frequently and thoroughly. If you feel sick, you must stay home. If you're in public, you must wear a mask. You must. If you're the type of person that reacts negatively to restrictions on your freedom, when you're told you must wear a mask, some of the folks that are watching probably feel right now, well, I don't feel like wearing a mask and I don't see the benefit of that. And we automatically will generate reasons we shouldn't do it. And so how might we use some of the knowledge that we've gained from behavioral science to reframe this, to give agency, if you like, to the person receiving the recommendation? And so one of the things that we found in our research and that we're suggesting is that if you could change the way you convey the information from "you can't do this" to, for example, "what are you doing to protect your loved ones?" And then have a list with a checkbox beside them of the exact same behaviors that we just talked about. Are you wearing a mask? What are you doing to protect your loved ones? I wear a mask when I'm in public. I make sure I stay 6 feet away from others. I wash my hands regularly. And you check them. Now you, the person, have agency. You're deciding that you're engaging in those behaviors. It's not a restriction of your freedom. And we think that if we simply can reframe the way we convey this information, it'll help enormously dampen the restriction that many of us naturally feel when things are taken away from us in terms of our freedoms. Policymakers are telling us how to fight the pandemic already. And so with a small shift in how those recommendations are conveyed to us, behavioral science suggests that America can and get through this crisis while minimizing the negative consequences that might come from the completely natural reaction that folks have to their freedoms feeling threatened. And so I hope that has generated some ideas for each of us. Those of you that are in the position to convey information to, say, your employees, to folks in the area that you live and work. Um, if you can think about reframing things to give agency to the individuals, I think that we'll find that it'll be much more positively received than if we do the "you must do this, you must do that." So I see that there's some questions have come in uh, across the board from folks here. Um, so interesting question. Can discuss the intensity of the effect across countries. So it this reaction that people have to to uh, to restricted freedom is a universal. It happens everywhere in the world. So what's interesting is that what you expect your freedoms are culturally determined. And so in the US, people have a very strong feeling that they should have the freedom to, for example, engage uh, in uh, in they should be able to, for example, go to service on religious service. So that's something that people feel very strongly in the U.S. Now, other countries may not have that expectation that that's a freedom that they should have all the time. In which case, removing it or threatening to remove it for them won't trigger the same backlash as it does here in the U.S. But in that country, there may be other freedoms that people expect, and if you threaten the freedom that is expected, you'll get the same kind of backlash. Um, so let's see, thoughts on uh, psychology of scarcity today. That's an interesting question. So a lot of what we're talking about here really is centered around this notion of scarcity, and so the the natural reaction that folks have when something feels scarce is, as I mentioned earlier, is for it to feel more appealing. And so when it feels scarce, that resource becomes much more attractive. And so we feel that we really do need to have it. And so, um, you know, it's interesting to look at what drives these scarcity reactions. I have a research partner at Kimberly Clark, which is one of the world's biggest manufacturers of paper goods, and they were, to be totally honest, they were completely caught off guard. I hope I'm not throwing them under the bus with the reaction to and the stockpiling of the paper goods. And when it started, they saw it happening, but they thought, well, this doesn't make sense. I mean, this is not something hand sanitizer or cleansers that you need for your personal safety makes sense. Paper goods don't you don't need those at any higher rates than we have in the past. So this should just be a blip. Well, obviously it's not a blip, and they've worked incredibly hard to fill the supply chain. But as soon as that sense occurs to each of us that our freedom to buy paper goods is threatened, those paper products become way more exciting and popular and attractive to us, and we chase after them. Have I seen good examples of business applying this type of behavior to change stay-at-home efforts? So, to be totally frank, no, I don't think that anybody's really doing it well just yet. And I think partly one of the reasons I wanted to do this LinkedIn Live is to get the word out to many folks like yourselves that are business leaders that have an opportunity to change the frame. You know, everything I've seen so far, and again, I haven't seen the whole universe of communications, but people have largely been following the lead of government agencies, which are basically placing these things across as mandates. There have been a couple of television advertisements that I've seen that take a softer position and try to emphasize family connection, et cetera. And they're getting closer, I think, to having agency be conveyed to the decision maker. But I'm hoping that, as I say, that one of the goals of doing this today is that we can start to hopefully have some of our organizations do a good job at some of these ideas. Oh, do people react like this to other regulations? Yeah, so we've done a lot of work. So for example, uh, speed limits. People, if you learned that that speed limits in your town were about to go down universally, they tell you, you know, we're going to cut the speed limit because it'll reduce pedestrian injuries. It'll reduce accidents. It uses less fuel. These are all rational reasons for reducing the speed limit. But if I tell you that your community is going to decrease the speed limit, we find that through the roof, people are like, no way, that's a ridiculous idea. We need to be able to drive at least as fast as we're going right now. And if anything, we get the backlash where they want to drive even faster than they have for many years in their community. Similar events in history, people have reacted similarly to some small rules and regulations. Well, so there's been many examples over the years where rules are imposed and people don't like those rules. And obviously the one that led to, well, I grew up in Canada, so I shouldn't speak for all Americans. But the America's independence was basically generated and came out of some silly taxation rules that were imposed by the British government. People hated that so much that they took arm and rebelled and became an independent nation. And you see these things over and over and over again. The key underlying element is that you have to believe it's a freedom that that you have. If you don't ever have the freedom to do something, right, then you won't react aggressively and negatively to it. But to the degree you feel that this is a freedom that is afforded to you by life, by your country, by your religion, whatever it is, if you feel that it's a real freedom, you will react and defend it aggressively. And we've seen this over and over and over again over the years. So a question about, let's see, with some airlines now requiring face masks, can they deny passenger access if they refuse? How should they communicate that? My understanding, again, I'm not an expert in the sort of the federal aviation space, but my understanding is that they certainly will be able to refuse entry to the airplane. I think if I were the airplanes, or if I were the airlines, I would be sending a communication in advance to all of my passengers, basically with, again, trying to convey agency to them. So we want to have our planes be as safe as possible for you and your family while you fly. Here's the checklist of things that you can do to protect your loved ones while flying. Now, they may be mandated by law, but if you say they're mandated by law, I think you'll run the risk of getting some backlash. And those, if you give the agency to the passenger, I think that increases the likelihood of compliance at a higher level. This is a great question. So how would you suggest correcting someone if you see them violating COVID safety guidelines in public? This is, I think, a very challenging interpersonal situation, and I would really urge caution in this space. In reviewing, what's been happening over the last month or so, I've come across a large number of situations where a well-meaning member of the public has said to someone, "Hey, you need to engage in social distancing, or you should be wearing a mask." Those folks sometimes react very aggressively. And there's been incidents where they've been physically aggressive, emotionally aggressive, etc. So I almost err on the side of avoiding, unless it's impinging on your personal space, in which case you need to do something to protect yourself. But I personally would not encourage anybody to spontaneously approach someone that is flagrantly violating the rules, um, you know, at a minimum, a random person coming up and saying, "Hey, you need to be wearing your mask." That person's not wearing a mask already because they've decided that freedom is really important to them. And uh, and and if you threaten it even more, it's going to heighten their reaction, and they're going to, again, the potential for negative outcomes is substantial. Um, so yeah, an interesting one. So, are there ways that you can manage your own way of thinking, processing when rules are being dictated to you? I think absolutely. And so, I'll give that example from my wife with the "Can you pick up the milk?" Um, you, if you start to observe and sort of stay attuned to your reaction when you're generating those counter arguments, right, for why you shouldn't engage in this behavior, uh, you'll start over time to be able to notice you're doing it, perhaps. And I've been studying this for years. I can sometimes realize it's happening to me. When that's the case, you can flip into the other mode. Well, why would I want to do this? What are the pros for me engaging in this behavior? And again, if you can flip it from "this is a threat to my freedom" to "I have agency and I can choose what to do or not to do," it can really dramatically shift the mindset that you have uh, in terms of complying with the restrictions. Um, Another interesting question: once someone's reacted negatively, can you talk them back down by using this more positive framing? Absolutely. There is absolutely no question that an initial negative reaction can be overcome by switching the frame and making the person feel like they're part of the decision, and that it's not being completely dictated to them. And so I think that, we've got a lot of research that shows that this is the case. And so don't give up on the loved ones and family members and employees that are initially backlashing to following the guidelines. I think if we can reframe things, make them feel like they're part of the solution, that they have a hand in deciding what that they're going to do, I think that there's definitely a lot of positive that can come of things. Um, well, I hope that this dialogue has been a positive one, and I hope it's planted the seed for ways that each of us can have a positive impact as we try to move out of this COVID-19 crisis and get back, quote unquote, to normal. Wouldn't that be great? And uh, feel free to reach out to me if you have further questions. And my email is just Gavan, Gavan, @duke.edu. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts, and potentially if any of you are running organizations, to give you some suggestions about ways that could be helpful as you move forward. Next week, we have Professor Manju Puri, who is one of my colleagues at Fuqua and a professor of finance. And Manju is going to be talking a little bit about federal aid programs and their role and impact as we emerge from the COVID crisis. Let's see, I'm looking to see if there are any last questions. I think that we've got almost all of the questions. So maybe one last sort of closing thought might be, each of us have the opportunity on maybe a macro level, if you're running an organization or a government agency, et cetera, to have a big impact on the world around us by changing the way that we communicate broadly to the entire nation, right? But all of us have the opportunity to have an impact on a micro level with our friends and loved ones. And I hope that our broader Fuqua community, if we all do a little bit and shape our immediate networks, we can have the kind of positive impact as a group that will make a difference. Changing the frame, making our friends and loved ones feel like they have agency, um, it can change pretty dramatically the way people respond to the restrictions. And if we listen to the health experts, these restrictions are necessary. We have to do them as a society. So it's really about getting folks like myself that bristle to restriction uh, to get on board and feel like they're part of the solution and that they have agency and that they can help the ones that they are close to and love. And with a little luck, we'll reduce those number of folks going to the beach to play beach volleyball. We'll reduce the number of folks walking through public places with no masks, and we'll get out of this sooner rather than later. On behalf of everybody at Fuqua, thanks to all of you for listening, and really look forward to hopefully seeing many of you in person sooner rather than later.